morning, wherever you are to you. I hope you're well, and I hope you are looking forward to a little bit of time off during the festive season. And I wish you a very merry one. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Jules. Thank you very much for preparing all this, Jules. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Chris.
And if I get the slides going, then we can start with this rather extensive funding update. So here is the introduction. We don't really need that, you know it. This is the task for today. I'm trying to, I've collated the following slides with my colleagues around the world. And we are trying to provide you in the space of half an hour, 14 minutes, a comprehensive, brief, and yet pragmatic overview of what institutional donors and funding trends are likely going to be important for 2024. My colleagues have spoken to many institutional donors in the last few days directly, USAID, GIZ, several people in Brussels in the EU, and a few country embassies as well, to see what they are expecting in 2024. There's a few information in there that you might find interesting. The inherent challenge to such a webinar today is that I've got half an hour, 40 minutes to cover most donors, which is a thing of near impossibility. And the other inherent challenge I have is that Jules will ruthlessly cut me off at 45 minutes latest, because we do have a lot of participants and we do have a lot of Q&As always. And that brings me to say that if you have questions, if you have comments or questions that you would like to have answered here and or directly, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, somewhere there or so. Otherwise, Jules will find it very hard to read questions out if you put them into the chat box. So please use the Q&A. Is that right, Jules?
That is perfect. Thank you, Chris. I think you've done all my housekeeping rules of the day.
Well, it is coming to the festive season, so you can take it a little easier today.
Thank you.
Before we start, you can, of course, get a monthly overview of the global funding trends, as well as news from various sectors, from selected donors, as well as tailored and detailed funding advice on our website. Particularly, I would recommend, even though I do co-write this newsletter, to subscribe to the newsletter here and the various social media channels. Jules, remind me if I'm wrong, we are covering climate change donors next in the next newsletter, is that right? Or we did that recently?
Yes, we have just done climate change and I'm not 100% sure what's next.
Oh, wasn't it gender donors, particular gender program, gender sensitive programming, something. So anyway, point being, every newsletter or every few newsletters, you get a particular interest, and we go around the donors and see what they do in that particular thematic area. So the newsletter can be quite useful. Let's get started. Before we look at the donors, I want to share with you some important research we have done together with our 300 or so NGO and nonprofit partners since 2018. The data we have been basing this on is from consenting, anonymized past and present clients, as well as publicly available information since 2011. So it's pretty decent data based on over 10 years of financial data, mostly working in this sector. And we've asked the question, what makes an NGO financially sustainable? Now, that can mean a lot of things, but without going into too much detail, we found out that there are three things that are common amongst most financially successful organizations. The organizations have 30% or more unrestricted. And if they do, they are 4 times less likely to fall into some form of financial distress than those who have lower unrestricted rates. And financial distress can mean anything from just not having enough money for important or key functions of your organization, right down all the way to bankruptcy. So that 30%, having at least 30% unrestricted seems very important. If you do not have that, there may be a diversification needed to generate that. NGOs that manage to grow, at least financially, and that is not a proxy for impact, of course, But if we're taking it as a growth per se as good, which there are many problems with, then we also find that they mature their existing donors to the degree of 15% year on year. And this is a very complicated, very management accountancy way of saying that they get 10 to 15% more from their existing donors every year. So they mature them up, they very actively manage these relationships. And it's obviously easier to convince an existing donor to give a bit more than to acquire a new one. But interestingly enough, organizations that continuously grow over that time span of 12 years are also adding at least 2 new donors per year, per calendar year. So that is indicative to me of a very active business development function, a very large degree of business acumen, and a really appealing mission. Finally, looking at the expense side of where our partners have spent the money, is not surprisingly that NGOs who grow continuously over that 10-12 years period have also invested substantially and permanently into business development. They've continuously issued donor mappings, hired new staff, asked consultants to take a view into new forms of funding, etc., etc. So they've just seen this as a priority area, and unsurprisingly, they've gotten more out of it. I think important here is the notice that they've invested into it permanently. It doesn't matter so much how much they invest, as it does the continuation of that investment. And that has been seen as a key amongst all those 350 organizations we've analyzed over the last 10 years as a common factor of growth. Hopefully that helps you, and that sets you hopefully in mind when we look at the individual donors right now. And we are starting with the right amount or the right type of funding that most organizations require. Moving on. There's this myth of diversification, which a colleague of mine has summed up by saying many donors are good, the right ones are better. So the donor diversification has been discussed hotly over the last 10 years. It's been a golden holy grail of NGOs. But the fact is that there is no such thing as a perfect mix for NGOs. For example, if your mission is advocacy or less program implementation based, then you do need a higher unrestricted rate, for which some donors are less suitable for. The recovery rates from the EU, for example, are much less than that of USAID. So getting the right donors, in our view, is far more important than diversification per se. As Ras just said, we're aiming, MZM partners, we're aiming at 30% unrestricted funding, and to actively manage large donors and add 2 new institutions per year. That is a pretty good success mark, as well as the last one, which is often forgotten, about minimizing the proposal development costs. At the moment, with many of our partners, we see that proposal development costs are pretty high. So it's an almost exhaustive effort to write a proposal and send it out. Minimizing that, streamlining that, productizing that has a lot of success mileage in it. Good. Now, let's start finally with the title of this one, having a look at a few selected institutions. And the overall institutions were, as you would expect, that dominant funding from bilateral donors was based and focused on Ukrainian response. Pre-2023, this was the COVID response. This shouldn't surprise anything. The top funding themes of this year so far have, up to Q3 at least, has been infrastructure again. Usually tops the funding theme. Health, as you would expect, inclusive development, education, agriculture, and then climate change response. There is a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of Indus languages. An agriculture project can be climate active as well, but these continue to be the largest themes that institutional donors have invested their money in 2023. What's also really interesting is that the private sector partnership and the investor involvement are increasing very sharply. We'll talk about this a little bit more under USAID. here, but the private sector partnerships, new mixed forms of funding between grants and commercial contracts have really increased substantially this year. That has changed the funding landscape once again substantially. We also have to admit and be open to the fact that pure advocacy-based work, particularly when it comes to inclusive development or society support or democratic reforms, is quite hard to fund by grants and is better funded by other instruments, some of which we look here today. That has been, I think, something we all felt for a while and needs to be acknowledged, but several donors have told us flat out right that pure advocacy or events-based funding on grants is not something they would look at supporting much longer. Okay, the major trends therefore in 2024. We've asked our donors contacts that. What would you expect the major trends to be in 2024? And it's pretty much the list that you would expect. Localization is definitely on top of that list. The charge here is the initiative is definitely led by USAID. We'll talk about that in a minute. Private sector partnerships, as I mentioned just now, with new mixed forms of funding that combine grants and commercial contracts elements. I think that's quite interesting. And another area where grants are probably, pure grants are probably reducing. Commercial and service contracts are increasing. In fact, major donors, including Germany and the EU, are having specific private sector and business approaches to get companies involved into areas that would previously be reserved for NGOs. The EU is talking a lot about the peace, development, and humanitarian nexus. So if you do write an EU proposal, you might want to mention that, how your, for example, development or your humanitarian proposal is also peace promoting or vice versa. And as I said, the non-profit with business grants instruments are a new development this year. All the donors have basically said in preparation for this conversation today that they're looking for way more co-creation, and they're actively investing in co-creation. Some donors even investing, significant sums of money of translating their content away from the home language into other languages, including Spanish and Arabic, and in order to facilitate and deal with more involvement from particularly small businesses and medium-sized businesses. So this being reactive to calls and TORs as they are being published has not been enough, long time, but it's increasingly coming to an end. Really, most of our partners have significant challenges funding a sustainable operation by just being reactive. Okay, let's start with the single largest donor in the world, the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. And 2024 looks like it's going to be another record year. 2023 has been, excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, I do have a small cold. It's very cold, as Jules said. 2023 was a record year based on the Ukrainian and the outgoing COVID response. 2024 looks again for a significant increase in that. That increase kind of flows over from this year because USAID did not manage, or is likely not to manage in the last 3 weeks remaining, to contract out all the funding committed in 2023. So there's going to be some overhang. The recipients, as last year, have been mostly multilateral institutions and organizations, the contractors, and the 10 largest NGOs, which are global. But USAID, as I said, really leads the pack, really is being very focused on working with localized organizations, NGOs, small and mid-sized businesses, and that work that they've been talking about for several years, frankly, seems to be gaining some speed. Not beyond the work with USAID website, they are really reaching out, having local engagement events, sending out requests for information to elicit co-creation for programs before going for a request for purchase. So I would expect a lot more to be pushed to these mid-sized for-profit and not-for-profit, as well as local implementation agencies, particular from USAID. The thematic focus here follows on the big things that someone from USAID told me yesterday. They are probably not going to change, and they remain private sector partnerships, localization taking center stage, health, global health, as well as health security. And then they are also very prominent and very keen about the gender equality, thinking to introduce gender audits into the larger contracts as a requirement, and obviously their continued assistance to Ukraine. USAID is increasingly diversified. They are looking also to give more power of contracting to local staff for the large areas they're moving. The core programs are likely remaining constant, but there are two major developments that you may want to be aware of. There's a new head of acquisition and assistance coming in, or came in recently, so there's a new leadership in procurement, and that will have an effect later next year. And obviously in the US, it's going to be an election year. So that will have some sort of effect. But I think the localization and private sector partnerships are absolutely key success factors for anyone. I would urge anybody who's interested in getting USAID funding or just staying informed to register on the website that my colleague has given here on the slide. Monitor the large calls as well as the requests for information. Join into the quarterly business forecast. I think the next one is happening on Thursday this week, so you can sign up for that. And obviously ask contractors, awardees for subcontracting opportunities, or ask my colleagues around the world how to engage on your particular topic. At the same time, at the right time, I mean, when you are ready to have your first 2 or 3 contracts with them, it's really about time to start a NICRA application process. The NICRA application process is the process which allows you to charge a number of unrestricted or general support to your direct costs. The de minimis is currently only 10%. They're looking to increase that to 15%, but for now it's 10%. And 10% is pretty low as far as cost recovery goes. So if USAID is going to be a frequent part or a big part of your funding portfolio, I would certainly prepare an application to increase that unrestricted rate beyond 10% in order to make it financially sustainable, and that would be the NICRA. I think that's the USAID. Let's hop over the pond over to our friends in the UK, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Obviously, it's no longer DFID. They've earmarked nearly 7 billion for aid in 2022-2023. The year there runs until April 2023. But there are previously they said there is an increase by about 1.4 billion being considered. That is now being questioned, rather unsurprisingly. It's still on the cards, but whether it's really going to be forthcoming in April is anyone's guess. Continued support on Ukraine, as you would expect, with a increasing migration or focus here. The top themes are pretty much expected to remain the same, they tell us, as in 2023. So environment, natural resources, innovation, and communication technology, agriculture, very much in line with Europe actually on this one, as well as energy and humanitarian aid. What's really good to know, if you are a small organization or if you are looking to do something a little bit new, then the FCDO is still a very good funder for its innovation fund and its Small Charities Challenge Fund, highlighted here in big fat blue. These can provide a flexible amount of funding for an idea you have that might just work. Competition is quite high on these, but the instruments themselves are pretty flexible. So that might be a route for you to get a innovation or a new way of doing things off the ground. However, my colleague's warning here is we would expect fierce competition for the remaining UK funds as more and more UK organizations lose access to the EU funding from 2027 onwards. So we haven't got that much time left. 3-4 year programs are already getting a bit tight to get in there as Brexit is being executed across Brussels as well. So basically we have a smaller pie and a larger amount of NGOs applying for it. Let's have a look at Brussels. Brussels, as you may know from the previous update, is in its 2019 to 2024 focus with these 4 priorities here. The third one being climate neutral, green, fair and social Europe, in which funding is also being made available for the neighborhood of the European neighborhood. There's around about 30 programs providing funding for EU member states as well as these partner countries. Bear in mind, even if you're not an EU member, if you're not an organization from an EU member state, you are eligible if your programs work in what the OECD unhelpfully terms the least developed countries. But that's the way the EU shares that agreement. Of course, if you're in research, you can also apply for the Horizon program. That is the UK has access to that again, as well as the EU for Health program, even if you're not in the EU there. But beyond that, you need to be an EU member, and the EU pot is getting larger again. Here are some selected funds. I don't want to read them out. You will get the slides. Jules, remind me again, when are people getting the slides, or when are the slides being uploaded?
They're actually already uploaded on our website, but the emailer will go out by tomorrow morning. Good.
Okay, so tomorrow morning, an email with a link comes. The last one here, the Global Europe, is the largest pot of funding, or the most relevant pot of funding, as it governs all EU cooperation with non-EU third-party countries, except for these pre-accession countries, of course. So there you have a large instrument that may be relevant for most of you. And I think all of these red things are links which take you directly to the relevant part of the EU website, which is huge and not the most easiest to navigate. And as usual, any questions or problems or thoughts and ideas, feel free to reach out to me and my colleagues. DG INPA, as you may know, is the main agency for international cooperation. It was renamed a few years ago, and that carries out a number of initiatives that help the Commission fulfill their commitment towards the SDGs. INPA is really accounts for this most significant part of funding, and it spends around a third on infrastructure and economic support, 26% on human rights, democracy, peace. So if you work in these areas, absolutely essential to work with INPA. DG stands for Directorate General, by the way. It's sort of the department of the EU Commission. 23% is general budget support to government organizations, and 18 is on climate. That last part is going to increase after 2025. And the big part here is natural resource management. So if you are at all in that, that should absolutely be your focus. DG INPA is your search term. ECHO, as if you don't know, the ECHO is the Europeans' arm on humanitarian assistance, which, as this large pie chart shows, spends around about 350 million a year to be spent on food, nutrition, and 1.8 billion on humanitarian aid around the world. Lots of that is currently obviously going to the Middle East, and with new programs starting up almost by the day right now. And the way to become ECHO certified is to obtain a certificate of partnership, to where you are then allowed to bid for humanitarian contracts. So that would be EU ECHO. Let's go over to the Germans. Yeah, The current coalition agreement, which runs till 2025, so we're covered next year, lists these 5 development priorities for the German government: health, pandemic preparedness, gender equality, education, food security, and climate mitigation and adaptation. The GIZ, a government-owned company, has just renewed its membership in the Green Climate Fund, which is $19 billion strong. So they have been a member since 2010, and that renewed membership has just been announced at COP28 in Dubai, I think earlier today, actually. It's the largest climate fund worldwide, which is now even using some innovative finance products like green bonds on infrastructure. GIZ itself can administer and draw from that fund, and it's focused on water, biodiversity, and then there are about hundreds of other projects under this. So if you do go to the GIZ website and look for the Green Climate Fund funding, and if you do anything to do around climate, then that is a large pot that you can't really ignore. Other than that, agriculture and food security is funded through the BMZ, mandated by the GIZ, One World No Hunger Initiative, 615 million, and that's been in implementation since 2022. Admittedly, it's had a slow start, so we're expecting way more procurement to happen in 2024 here, or so the BMZ tells us. Flight and migration is again a BMZ funded, GIZ implemented program of around 450 million. The BMZ tells us that a portion of that fund has already been committed, but there is expected to be more procurement happening under that tackling root causes of displacement fund in early 2024. I'm aware that the procurement team at BMZ and GIZ are very actively working on that one right now. Oh, I shouldn't do any webinars whilst having a cold anymore. Okay. Brief look at the footprint, because in the last webinar you all wanted to know that. This is the map there shows the current footprint of the GIZ. So you see there's around about 1,500 programs right now. This is literally as per beginning of the week, so day before yesterday or something, of which only 14% require co-financing. So there's a bit of a myth here. The links are all in there. There's a couple of upcoming calls you might find interesting. Particular one at the bottom there, where if you work in green industrial policies or just transition implications, or if you do anything around that area, then in next month there is a request for information and a request for collaboration on a large project under the link down there. As you can see from the map, most African countries, most Southeast Asian countries are involved to some degree into the GIZ, so is Latin America. So it's a much larger agency than you might expect. That also goes to line that Germany is now, I think, the second or third largest bilateral donor in the world. So it's had a lot more funding coming through over 2023. We had that slide already. Let's moving on. Lastly, we want to look a little bit into a few UN agencies. UNHCR, based in Geneva, has the strategy running up to next year with this 4 global approach: accountability for affected people, climate action, internal displacement, and statelessness. The budget is 10.6 billion. Supporting UNHCR. It's a substantial budget with these 16 outcome areas that are all based here. And we listed the first 8 ones, and then they have so-called enabling areas. The important thing for you to remember is that these enabling areas need to be mentioned in some way, shape, or form into a good UNHCR proposal. That's pretty much what this says. So you need to demonstrate, for example, that what you do has is based on enhanced operational support, or helps UNHCR also manage its supply chain, or represents an enhanced partnership. How you do that is down to your creativity. Upcoming calls are on the United Nations Marketplace at the bottom left, or the UN Partner Portal. Just a small word of warning, we understand that the UN Partner Portal requires a few more hours, a few more days, up to a day or so, to update itself at the moment. I'm not sure if that's a temporary effort, but problem, but I hear that was a problem a few weeks ago. So the United Nations General Marketplace, UNGM, might be your first and best port of call here. No, there we are. Is that it? Oh, no, that isn't. And then we look at UNICEF. UNICEF, of course, being an NGO, but UN affiliated. Its key focus areas are still in the 2022-2025 strategic funding network. So if you do work somehow on areas that are important to UNICEF, that strategic framework is something you should definitely quote and be aware of when writing an application. Its focus lies on transformative system change, addressing these underlying causes of children's mortality, poverty, and vulnerability. So getting a little bit beyond direct service delivery and recovery strategy from these prolonged impacts that children continue to suffer from COVID. Obviously, it's also active in the current crisis. The recent strategic shifts, UNICEF tells us, has been a focus on their own digitalization, improving their own program implementation, streamlining operations. So we should have a good increase in operating speed at UNICEF, hopefully next year. And its focus on climate change and urbanization, really understanding the effects of climate change in rural communities and how that impacts children in these rapidly urbanizing environments, rapidly changing environments. The website for upcoming calls for UNICEF directly is mentioned at the bottom of the slide for your pleasure. And as well, UNGM is a decent point of call here. Good. I think that is addressing USAID, European Union, the Brits, the FCDO, the UN agency, and the GIZ. And I think I'm running out of time here before Jules starts shouting at me. I'm hitting the half-an-hour mark right now. And I think that is it for me this year on donor updates. And I think, Jules, you got a couple of messages. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. Thank you so much, Chris, for running through everything so wonderfully. We do have quite a lot of questions that have come in through the chat, the usual chat. Please do pop them in the Q&A box, just because I will be reading the questions from the Q&A box first. So please do pop your questions from the chat into the Q&A. Chris, if you just pop on to the next slide, that would be great.
Sure.
So as most of you would know, our training courses are back in full force. We are incredibly oversubscribed for quite a few of the courses, especially our right-winning proposals. But we do offer this opportunity for you to please take a look at our website under training courses and sign up for 2024. We have wonderful things on offer, and we are only growing this portfolio, and we look forward to hosting you. At the moment, our courses are the right-winning proposals, grants and beyond, diversifying income and building reserves. And then our third one is getting project budgeting and reporting right. So 3 very interesting topics where you can learn lots and lots from our consultants.
And I did do the first Grants and Beyond course in London last month, and it was absolutely fantastic. So if any participants are here that were there, we had a really good 2 days together.
Please pop to the next slide. We have this is our final webinar for 2023, as you probably heard in the beginning. And our next webinar is the last week of January, 10 tips to improve your proposal budget, hosted by Hyundai. And then we have we actually have quite a few new topics next year. So we're very excited. We are getting them all launched and underway. So by the end of this week, we will have them on our website. But AI and proposal writing in funding support, which Chris will be presenting. So we are very excited about our first in the new series.
Together with the owner of an AI company, by the way.
So we are very excited about those. So please do register, and you'll find all of our webinars on our website.
Great. Cool. Can I close the slides and go to question mode?
Yes, perfect. I'm ready. Right. So as I have mentioned, I will be reading the questions from the Q&A box first. I will try and get through the webinar chat, but if you do have a second, please pop it into the Q&A. So Lindsay has asked us a question. So when you say advocacy work is hard to fund by grants, do you include strategic litigation in that rather than typical or awareness raising campaigns?
Lindsay, thank you very much for asking that question. Strategic litigation is majorly important, of course. And no, I wouldn't necessarily include that per se. It depends on what. I'm aware that there are 2 or 3 large foundations which are specifically interested in forcing strategic litigation and working through the legal system in achieving certain standards or securing the certain laws. So if you tell me a little bit more, maybe by an email, to what strategic litigation you are doing, then I might be able to take a look at our latest funding review on advocacy, and that's where 2 foundations really stuck out. But I wouldn't immediately associate them to advocacy work. That said, advocacy and events work and pure awareness work has always been increasingly difficult to fund, and the donors have been feeding back to us simply the fact that they are less interested in that. They want more hard results coming out of work, and that's difficult to do empirically with advocacy work. Obviously, less difficult to do with strategic litigation.
Great, thank you, Chris. Edwin has asked a question. Does the European funds have a priority on a specific continent? Years ago, they were moving to Africa and leaving America. Does that trend continue?
Edwin, thank you very much for that question. It depends on which funds you mean. The EU neighborhood instrument, by its very defined neighborhood, funds things in what many call the sphere of influence. So it's looking at the Mediterranean season, north of the Sahara, Middle East, Eastern Europe. Then the instrument of INPA that I presented here doesn't have a geographic focus as such, but it allocates more funding to Africa than any other region. That's true. And lastly, the ECHO, the EU Fund for Humanitarian Aid, that indeed is driven by the humanitarian disasters, that does not have particular funding focus, geographic focus. So that depends entirely on where terrible things happen in the world. So the EU is a complex animal. It depends which fund you're referring to. And obviously the pre-accession funds goes to pre-accession countries, obviously. Jules, are you having connectivity problems? I take it that Jules is having some connectivity problems, so I'm just gonna find the next question myself. And Mariam Sawa, you said that, can you please provide a link where you can find more information about FCDO funding opportunities? A call came up earlier this year, but no details. Sure, Mariam, the FCDO link should be in the slides that you can download there. And you can also just Google for it. It has a procurement portal that is relatively straightforward to use. If you email me details about that fund directly, then you can also, I can have a look in our database and see if I find any information about that link. Jules, are you back?
Great, thank you. Yeah, sorry, we have connectivity issues at the moment. And
I thought so. I took one question from Mariam.
Thank you very much.
You're back in charge.
Is DG-INTPA funding available for UK-based organizations?
Lindsay, I can see the question. So DG INPA is a EU program, as I said before. Its main instrument for external action and development engagement, and funding to the UK is limited to programs taking place either in the least developed countries or where you have a local lead. or an extraordinary reason to do so. The budget of INPA runs between 2020 runs up to 2027, and it started pre-Brexit. So we're expecting that access to non-EU organizations to become even less after 2027, which is good news for European organizations and terrible news for non-European organizations.
Great, thank you, Chris. Alexandra has asked, is the FCDO's Innovation Fund for the impact of Global Innovation Fund or something different? Please, can you provide a link?
That's a good idea to put a link in. So, Alexandra, innovation funds are generally the term that donors use where they say this is a relatively formless and unrestricted form of funding. You can apply with pretty much any idea. I know that the Innovation Fund of the UK has a rolling deadline, so you can apply at any point. It's incredibly competitive, though. Someone has told me recently that they're getting around about 2,500 proposals a month, of which less than 1% get funded. So the idea really needs to be good. The proposal needs to be excellent. It is not an easy pot of money to get to. And that might be different from other innovation funds. There are thematic innovation funds. I know there is a Development Innovation Ventures jointly with USAID, or there was. There's a Medical Innovation Fund, which obviously looks at medical and health-related stuff. So there are various thematic innovation funds. Oh, Jules, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was still muted. Apologies. From an anonymous attendee, where can we find detailed eligibility rules for different German government funding agencies? Is the registration in Germany a condition?
Thanks for asking that question. I think we should, but we're getting more and more questions on eligibility. I think we should do an event on that next year, Jules.
Sounds good.
On the UK to EU and within Europe. So thanks very much for asking the question whether what German eligibility looks like. Any German donor agency has to comply with the European rules, which means that European organizations can apply vis-a-vis in the same way, shape, and form as non-Germans can be, as long as you're an EU member state. The only pragmatic advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you see it, you have is if it's a commercial contract and you are a member state organization that is not German, the VAT treatment is going to be slightly different. That may not require you to charge VAT, which makes it cheaper makes the program cheaper for the Germans. So that's actually an advantage there due to the VAT rules. If you are not a European organization, then the same eligibility problems come as discussed previously. So by and large and by default, European funding, including that of member states, is available to European members organizations only, with a few exemptions.
Great, thank you, Chris. Pascal has asked, education is a trend, but I guess most funding is given to bilateral, multilateral organizations and governments and not to local civil society organizations.
Wonderful to see you here, Pascal. I love hearing your question. Most funding from USAID and the EU is indeed going to these bilaterals. However, we see a lot of bilaterals then again contracting procurement and services from NGOs. So the funding, they're acting sort of as a through funder, of course. The other one being is that technologically assisted education, so we've got a number of clients there, is often directly procured by the government. So GIZ, for example, is quite big on that. There's a lot of literacy-based programs that we have secured funding for directly from those agencies. So it depends on which area of education.
Thanks, Chris. Lindsay has asked another question. It's not clear on the UNGM website where any calls for proposals or grants would be. It's all about procurement of services. Can you give us any tips or links to find the grants?
Lindsay, may I just ask you to just send me a quick email, chris@mzninternational.com, and I'll send you the direct link. UNGM is separating, and it's a good question you're asking, that is separating services, procurement, and grants. And if you do, I think if you're in the procurement, then it's more procurement of physical things, and services are obviously services. But I'll send you the direct link back, or the filter option, because you're right, it's a very complex website with a lot of information on there.
Great, thanks, Chris. Catherine has asked, application forms often explicitly direct us to comment on how we relate to the priorities of donors in the format of the template. Do you recommend we go beyond that where appropriate? Example, if we know they care about something else that we also offer talk about, but they are not asking about it, should we use word allowances to include such detail?
Catherine, wonderful to see you here. Yes, is my short answer if I had to. So just yesterday, I spoke to a director in procurement of a large donor agency, and he said over and over again that they're receiving a lot of applications where it's pretty clear that the applicant has not read the country or the regional or the thematic strategy. So if you can imagine, donors just don't create programs like this. There's usually a strategy, a country or a thematic strategy. And then there is an annual plan or a multi-annual plan. And then there's the procurement, and the TORs. If it is pretty obvious from an application when the applicant has only read the request for purchase or the request, the terms of reference, without being aware of the underlying information I've just listed. So I would definitely quote them as far as they're relevant, not going the kitchen sink approach, not quoting back to them what they have written, but making it clear that you're aware of that and that your program continues their overall strategy.
Great, thanks, Chris. We only have 10 more minutes at most, so we'll try and get through. We have 5 more open questions in the Q&A box. So Catalina has asked, is there a page where you can find open opportunities from several donors? Several donors.
Catalina, there are funding portals like developmentaid.org, devex.com, I believe it. There's a couple of others. There's even state agencies that collate them. The UNGM, for example, collates most, if not all, UN agencies' procurement. Grants.gov in the US provides grants from all US agencies down to municipal level. So there's a ton of them. What worries me about that question is that it might lead, and you might not think that, but it might lead to a thinking of, I see an application and I go and apply for it. As I said, this co-creation, this engagement is incredibly important. The idea of just seeing an RFP and sending an application and then being disappointed that we don't get money for it is a little bit outdated, if I'm very honest. So donors want to co-create, they need to co-create. Particularly this drive towards localization has highlighted to donors over and over again that they don't know what's best always. It's actually a positive development that we've been asking for decades. And as this localization trend continues, engaging with a donor agency pre-contract is essentially important. And that is a problem to some NGOs, which are frankly running around like headless chickens, who are so busy managing the programs they have and just applying for bids. That is going to be incredibly difficult to do without some strategic view on it, with a long-term angle. If you are in that rat race, please reach out to my colleagues on that. They provide a degree of assistance via funding support to get out of that rat race. And it's very affordable. It's about the price of an employee. I don't think you'll find that. I think you find that very good value.
Great, thank you, Chris. Catalina has asked, are there any tips for ECHO?
Yeah. So ECHO, the DG ECHO is the European Union's instrument for humanitarian aid. They do grants. They do have 2 large conferences per year as well, one in Brussels, one in one member state. So I would start engaging with those. For starters, they are very keen on speeding up the procurement process. So we're expecting the major, if that's successful, we're expecting the time it will take between a TOR being published and the bid being due to be reduced and even lower than that. So I would definitely continue to monitor that. And again, engage with them. They are not a dark entity that we can't talk to. We can definitely engage with them at the conferences, at their requests for information, at their topic papers online, and then you'll pretty soon get an impression of how they tick and how they work.
Great, thanks, Chris. Rosanna has asked quite a long question here. So the question may be a little bit too specific, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The European Commission released a large notice a week or so ago relating to their work in sub-Saharan Africa. It was valued at about 1.3 billion and covered all aspects of their work as part of the multi-annual indicative programming plan 23 to 25. I spotted it on Asortus, and it was written in such a confusing language. It's hard to tell whether the notice was simply to inform us that that's their plan or whether they're starting to tender. If you've seen it, can you share any light on it?
I've not seen that particular notice, Rosanna. Sorry, it is a bit specific. But what I'm going to do is take a look at it and email you my impression. If you were to send me an email that I can respond to you directly, or that I have your email address, that would be very useful, Rosanna. 1.3 billion euros sounds to me like a framework contract, or sounds to me like a program of programs where they pack several programs that would be multi-thematic and multi-country. So the language might be very general and wide, and you read it and you're not quite sure which donor which country they're talking about. But I'm curious now too. Please do send me the notice of the commission, and I'll take a look tomorrow and email you back.
Great, thanks, Chris. Okay, Rosanna's asked another question, and it is our final question of today. How do you suggest we engage meaningfully with donors? I often hear we should engage at the country level. However, their country offices are so busy, they often don't respond to attempts to engage.
Yeah, I would agree. So first of all, know your donor. So let's do some research about them. You can also ask donor experts, consultants about how to engage with them. Some organizations are easier to engage with than others. So for example, USAID, FCDO, GIZ, pretty easy to engage with because they have structures for that, requests for information, thematic conferences, where you can turn up and engage. Then the EU has it as well. The EU Development Days are sort of a must-go event in Brussels every year. I think the next they're usually held in spring, so the next one, or summer, the next one should be around in 6-7 months' time, where you hear about the major programs and talk directly to the various procurement officers. The major instrument is that thematic working groups and engagement and responding to their request for information. That's where you get into a dialogue with them. I think many people confuse engagement with self-marketing. The country officers, or indeed nobody, has any patience for listening to endless organizations, how great they are. They have very specific needs, these agencies, and I think engagement primarily means listening to what they want and listening to how they work, and then usually a conversation ensues. If you can't get anywhere, please reach out so I can suggest some specific engagement points.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay, then that's the last webinar for 2023 then.
Can't believe it.
Right.
It's gone very quickly.
The next one is just around the corner, Jules.
I know. Thank you everyone for joining us today from around the world. We hope that all that insight is very beneficial to you. Good luck with all your NGOs.
And thank you very much for all the amazing work you're doing. I really enjoyed meeting many of you this year. Many of you are Amsterdam partners. I appreciate a lot of what you do. And next year, my colleagues and I around the world will continue, of course, to help us all get better and continuously improve what you do. Thank you very much for your friendship as well, and hopefully see you very soon.
And have a great festive season. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.